Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are not just tiptoeing through history, we are wading directly into the chilling waters of a scandal so profound it reshaped an entire continent. Close your eyes for a moment and feel the damp spring air of May 1536 press against your face. You're standing on the bank of the Thames just outside the Palace of Greenwich, and the atmosphere is thick with a silence that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. The Tudor court, usually a vibrant, noisy carnival of silks and ambition, is hushed. You can hear the rhythmic dip and pull of the oars long before you see the royal barge glide towards the landing steps. This isn't a celebratory procession. This is the stage set for an execution long before the axe is even sharpened. You see her, Queen Anne Boleyn, radiant one moment, and then, as if a cloud has passed over the sun, utterly vulnerable the next. She has just been watching a tennis match, a frivolous distraction from the gnawing paranoia that has consumed the court for weeks. The king's behaviour has been erratic, his affections glacial, but even she, sharp and politically savvy as she is about to be blindsided. A carriage approaches the landing, not the king's, but one bearing Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, his face a mask of solemn, terrifying resolve, and with him, the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, the man whose loyalty to the king outweighed any familial tie. This is the moment. You watch as they approach Anne, their movements stiff, rehearsed. Cromwell speaks, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. The king is commanded, and the words that follow are a brutal slap of reality. Treason, adultery, and a warrant for your arrest. You probably won't survive this journey with your illusions intact, because what you're about to witness is not justice. It is the cynical, ruthless destruction of a queen who failed to secure a dynasty quickly enough. The shock ripples through you, even centuries later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, tell me where you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It always grounds me to know we are sharing this dark hour across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You observe Anne's reaction. It's a masterful blend of shock and immediate sharp defiance. She doesn't collapse into hysterics. That would be too easy, too predictable for the men watching her. Instead, she draws herself up, her eyes flashing with the fire that first captivated the king. "The king knows me innocent," she declares, a mainstream historical fact that points to her immediate strategy, appealing directly to Henry's sense of justice and his lingering affection. She genuinely believed, for a brief, terrifying moment, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, a political manoeuvre by her enemies that Henry would soon correct. She couldn't grasp the cold, horrifying truth. Henry was no longer her protector. He was the architect of her ruin. You watch as the guards, strangely gentle, begin to escort her. But where are they going? Not to an ordinary prison. You are on the royal barge as it pulls away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich, heading not upriver towards Hampton Court and safety, but downriver towards a dark, looming fortress, the Tower of London. Even today, the sight of the tower is unsettling, but in 1536 it was a synonym for the scaffold. As you pass under the shadow of its walls, you notice a peculiar, perhaps even quirky or fringe tidbit. A little-known, smaller boat carrying several of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, including her own sister-in-law, Lady Rochford, is following close behind. These women, outwardly her friends and servants, were, in reality, spies. They were taken into custody after Anne and were used by Cromwell to pump her for information, creating a perverse echo chamber of betrayal around the Queen. Imagine thinking your closest confidants were there for comfort, only to realise their purpose was to gather every distraught murmur, every tearful complaint, and turn it into damning testimony. The atmosphere on the river is heavy with menace. You feel the cool spray of the Thames and hear the creak of the wood. Anne Boleyn, a woman who had fought for 7 years to wear the crown, who had literally changed the religious landscape of England just to secure her position, is now travelling to her inevitable doom. It's a journey filled with dark irony. Remember that moment when the king, so enamoured with her, swore he would tear England apart for her sake? Well, he is tearing her apart for the sake of his next marriage. This swift, brutal turn of events is a stark reminder that in Tudor politics, affection was a transactional commodity, and its shelf life was alarmingly short. You realise that the charge of high treason, levelled against a queen, required absolute proof of intent to harm the king or his heir. But the case being constructed wasn't about treason in the classic sense. It was about political necessity, dressed up in the garb of moral outrage. Historians still argue whether the entire plot was orchestrated purely by Thomas Cromwell as a means to depose a political rival, or if King Henry VIII was the primary instigator, using Cromwell as a convenient executioner for a wife he no longer desired. This is a critical debate because it determines whether Anne was a victim of political machinations she could never have understood, or the victim of a calculated, cold-blooded decision by the man who once wrote her love letters filled with florid Italian poetry. As the barge pulls into Traitor's Gate, yes, that infamous, terrible archway, the sheer weight of history presses down on you. Anne is helped onto the steps, and you trudge up behind her into the inner court. The people who see her, guards, yeomen, minor officials, do not cheer, nor do they openly weep. They stand in stunned silence. The unthinkable is happening. A crowned queen, arrested on charges of betraying her husband and sovereign. The audacity of the accusation alone could shatter her. She's taken directly to the Queen's lodging, but here's the cruel twist of the knife. These rooms were not just any royal chambers, they were the very rooms she had stayed in just 3 years earlier, before her coronation. They were decked out then in splendour, ready to host the radiant new Queen. Now they are her prison. The furniture, the tapestry, the very light filtering through the windows, it all screams a haunting, impossible contradiction. You can almost feel her touch the familiar fabric of a wall hanging and realise the full scope of her fall. It's like being arrested in the changing room just after winning the World Cup. It's a dark, comedic punchline only history could deliver. The questioning begins immediately, carried out by Cromwell's men and often led by Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower. They are not looking for truth. They are looking for evidence to support the predetermined conclusion. They press her on dates, on rumoured meetings, on conversations she had forgotten. Anne, in her distress, often spoke too much, her words tumbling out in a frantic attempt to defend herself, which her accusers then meticulously recorded and twisted. You hear her demanding to see the king, insisting that only his presence can clear this up. But Henry is gone, already planning his future with Jane Seymour, the woman who will replace Anne just days after the executioner has finished his grim work. You feel a profound sense of isolation surrounding Anne. The court is suddenly devoid of her friends. Her enemies, long suppressed, are now triumphant. She's entirely alone, save for the spies in her room. This is not just an arrest. It's a complete societal and political excommunication, carried out with chilling efficiency. The trap has sprung, and the Queen of England is now simply the most high-profile prisoner in the realm, a historical footnote being written in real time, in blood. The stage is set for the inevitable. But before the curtain falls, you will witness the theatrical horror of a trial that had absolutely no intention of seeking justice. The true scandal isn't the adultery Anne was accused of. The scandal is the system that allowed this elaborate, cold-blooded legal fiction to unfold. The clanking of the portcullis behind you is the sound of a door slamming shut on hope. You and Anne are now fully enclosed within the cold, grey embrace of the Tower of London. It's May 2nd, 1536, and the air here is heavy, not just with dampness, but with the concentrated misery of centuries. You trudge with her up the steep stone steps to the Queen's lodgings, the very chambers she had occupied in triumphant splendour 3 years prior for her coronation. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about in a previous episode? Well, Anne would probably trade a small vial of it for a moment of that old vanity right now, because the contrast between then and now is a psychological torture far more effective than any dungeon rack. As you step into the chambers, you feel the bizarre, stomach-churning irony of the situation. The rooms are still furnished regally, perhaps even purposefully left that way to twist the knife. The silks, the tapestries, the heavy, ornate bed. It's all a shimmering, cruel reminder of the height from which she has fallen. Anne Boleyn, a mainstream historical fact you must understand, had a keen sense of self-dramatisation. She knew she was a public figure, and even in this terrifying isolation, she was performing for an audience of one, the king, and perhaps posterity. Her initial reaction, witnessed by the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, is a desperate, fragmented defence. She doesn't scream or rage. Instead, she dissolves into fitful weeping, interspersed with manic declarations of innocence. You watch her pace, her silk gown trailing, her voice cracking as she speaks of her enemies and slander. "I am betrayed," she sobs, not yet fully grasping that the betrayal came from the very top. She genuinely believes that if she can just speak to Henry, look him in the eye, her innocence will be self-evident. This belief is the thin, glittering thread of hope she clings to in that locked tower. You, standing invisibly beside her, hear her confused ramblings being meticulously recorded. Kingston, a well-meaning but utterly loyal servant of the king, is not just a jailer. He is Cromwell's primary intelligence asset inside the prison. He records everything, from her tears to her questions. Did the king intend to marry again? Who were her accusers? These frantic questions, meant to gain clarity, are being interpreted as signs of guilt, desperation, or even a cunning plot to suborn witnesses. Her distress is evidence. A deeply unsettling, quirky, or fringe tidbit of the day is the unusual degree of surveillance surrounding Anne. It wasn't just Kingston and his guards. As mentioned before, some of her own ladies were arrested and housed with her. These women were specifically chosen for their loyalty to the king's new favourite, Jane Seymour, or their existing enmity towards Anne. Imagine being locked in a room where every consoling hand-pat, every sympathetic sigh, every whispered prayer is an intelligence-gathering operation. Anne asks one lady, "I hear that I shall be accused of sundry persons, and I am sorry that ever I have done them any wrong." An innocent, remorseful statement, right? But the lady immediately reports it as a veiled admission of guilt concerning her supposed affairs. The walls are listening, and they are reporting back to Cromwell, who is actively building the case outside. The psychological warfare must have been immense. Anne, a woman famous for her sharp wit and control, is deliberately being broken down. She's being fed rumours and half-truths, which in her fragile state she tries to dismiss, often making a slip of the tongue that is instantly seized upon. For instance, she once asked Kingston about the other men arrested, including Sir Francis Weston and Henry Norris. She reportedly said something along the lines of, "I fear I shall never see them again, nor them me." This simple lament is twisted into proof that she acknowledges their shared guilt. You step away for a moment and look out of the thick window. The world outside is still bustling. People are going about their business, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding inside the royal apartment. This isolation, this severing from her court, is what is truly crushing her. She's a creature of politics and society, and now she's nothing more than a caged bird. She's keenly aware of her status, however. She constantly reminds Kingston that she is the queen, not a common criminal. This is her last source of power, her dignity. She demands the proper deference, the respectful language, hoping that by maintaining the form of queenship, she can somehow reassert the substance. The concept of a queen being tried for treason was virtually unprecedented in England. Historically, queens were either quietly divorced, sent to a nunnery, or, as in the case of previous consorts, political figures who never achieved full queen status were deposed. But a reigning queen, the mother of an heir, being publicly accused of high treason and adultery, was a constitutional crisis layered with a political catastrophe. Historians still argue whether Cromwell intended Anne to be executed from the very start, or if he merely meant to neutralise her politically, only to have the king's absolute vengeful will push the proceedings towards the ultimate bloody conclusion. This nuance is vital. Was Cromwell the puppet master, or was he merely a very effective tool wielded by a despotic king who wanted a quick, clean annulment and a new wife? Imagine the cold, intellectual process of building the case. Outside the tower, Thomas Cromwell, with his legal acumen and ruthless efficiency, is assembling the pieces. He isn't dealing with hard evidence like letters or witnesses to specific acts. He's creating a tapestry of circumstance, rumour and forced confession. The charge is not just adultery, it is high treason, because according to Tudor law, sleeping with the Queen implies an attempt to subvert the royal succession and plot the king's death. Every kiss, every flirtatious conversation, every gift exchanged is being legally redefined as a capital offence. Anne's greatest, final hope lies in the notion of the king's love. She believes that the Henry she knew, the man who pursued her relentlessly and defied the Pope for her, will eventually intervene. She imagines a sudden pardon, a dramatic arrival of a messenger. But you know better. You know that Henry is already moving pieces on the chessboard. The political expediency of getting rid of Anne far outweighs any sentimental attachment. You observe Anne's descent from shock to a kind of desperate religious resignation. She begins to spend more time praying, her mind turning from the legal battle to the spiritual one. She's preparing, perhaps subconsciously, for her final role. You hear her speak about her daughter Elizabeth, her only true legacy. She worries about the child's future, knowing that her own downfall will inevitably smear her daughter's legitimacy. Her stay in these rooms, therefore, becomes a torturous waiting game. She is isolated, manipulated, and systematically stripped of her royal authority and emotional stability. The only glimmer of hope she finds is in her own conscience, the conviction that before God she's innocent of the specific capital crimes she's accused of. But in Henry VIII's England, divine innocence counted for nothing when the king's will was law. She is trapped in a gilded cage waiting for the legal machinery that Cromwell has oiled to grind her to dust. The next step is the construction of the Black Book, the dossier of alleged crimes, which will fully transform the Queen into a traitor. The scene now shifts dramatically outside the Tower walls, away from Anne's desolate isolation and into the buzzing, highly charged office of the man truly pulling the strings, Thomas Cromwell. You leave the damp stone and step into the warm, organised chaos of the Chief Minister's private chamber. It is here, under the watchful gaze of portraits depicting stern, ambitious men, that the Black Book, the meticulously compiled dossier against Queen Anne, is being created. This isn't just about gathering facts, it's about constructing a narrative of treason so compelling, so horrifying, that no one, especially not Henry VIII, could possibly dispute the verdict. Cromwell, a mainstream historical fact that underlines his genius and ruthlessness, was a self-made man, rising from obscurity through sheer talent and an almost frightening understanding of both law and human nature. He had once been Anne's ally, helping to engineer her marriage and the break with Rome. Now, with the king's favour chillingly withdrawn from the Queen, Cromwell recognised the deadly political shift and pivoted with the speed of a hungry crocodile. His survival, and his continued power, depended entirely on removing Anne quickly and cleanly. You watch as he dictates to his clerks, his voice a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of emotion. He's a legal engine, not a moral judge. The evidence he is compiling is not based on direct proof, but on inference, rumour, and most crucially, forced confessions. He is collecting every whispered slight, every flirtatious comment, every moment Anne showed presumptuousness toward the king, and weaving it into a pattern of seditious and adulterous behaviour. The goal is to prove Anne sought to destroy the king by subverting the succession, and had practised her abominable and incestuous purpose with numerous men. The foundation of the case rests on the testimony gathered from the Tower, the desperate, often contradictory statements extracted from the ladies-in-waiting and the arrested gentlemen. Cromwell is not interested in what Anne didn't do. He's only concerned with what can be said she did. He's utilising a legal principle that makes the charge of adultery against a queen into high treason. By allegedly sleeping with other men, Anne was putting potentially illegitimate children in line for the throne, thereby threatening the king's life and the stability of the realm, a classic legal sleight of hand. You observe the inclusion of a particularly chilling detail, a quirky or fringe tidbit in the grand sweep of the trial's construction. Cromwell deliberately included vague timeframes in the indictment, stating the adulterous acts occurred over a span of several years, rather than on specific dates. This was a tactical masterstroke. It made it almost impossible for Anne or the accused men to provide a solid alibi. They couldn't say, on June 7th, 1535, I was in Yorkshire, because the indictment simply claimed the act happened on divers days between 1533 and 1536. This calculated ambiguity ensured the Crown retained maximum flexibility in presenting its flimsy case, turning legal precision into an instrument of death. The Black Book is growing, section by section. It includes the names of the 5 men arrested: Henry Norris, the King's Groom of the Stool, a position of great intimacy and trust; Sir Francis Weston, a handsome young courtier; William Brereton, a loyal retainer of the King; the musician Mark Smeaton; and the most shocking addition, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother. This incest charge is the political equivalent of a nuclear bomb, designed not only to destroy Anne, but to utterly annihilate her family's reputation and legitimacy. Historians still argue whether Cromwell truly believed Anne was guilty of the crimes he was documenting, or if he was simply acting as a loyal minister carrying out the king's brutal will. There is little direct evidence either way, but the speed, efficiency and cynical construction of the case suggest a man focused entirely on political results, not moral conviction. Was he protecting the state from a treasonous queen, or protecting himself from a king who wanted a divorce disguised as an execution? This debate remains central to understanding Cromwell's own complex legacy. You watch him carefully review the forced confession of Mark Smeaton, the court musician. Smeaton, being of lower social standing, was likely subjected to torture or the threat of it, something the nobility were generally spared. His confession is the linchpin of the prosecution's case, the only piece of seemingly concrete proof that adultery took place. Smeaton admitted to sleeping with the Queen 3 times. Cromwell needed a willing witness, and Smeaton's social vulnerability made him the easiest target to break. The inclusion of Smeaton, the lowest ranking of the accused, was designed to show that Anne was promiscuous enough to even stoop to the level of a common musician, thereby further degrading her moral standing in the eyes of the public and the court. Cromwell's strategy is clear: paint Anne as a manipulative, sexually voracious and ultimately treasonous woman who sought to control the king and destroy the realm. By compiling every piece of hearsay and weaving it into a single, terrifying narrative, he transforms Anne from a politically inconvenient wife into an existential threat to England. The Black Book is not a legal document seeking justice. It is a meticulously crafted political weapon, honed to deliver a swift and certain death sentence. The sheer volume of fabricated material is staggering. One section details supposed gifts exchanged and flirtations, transforming a playful court culture into a series of clandestine, treasonous meetings. You see notes describing Anne telling Norris that she wished the king was dead, a statement likely made in a moment of frustration, now inflated into a capital plot to commit regicide. Everything is warped, magnified, and given a sinister interpretation. You feel the cold calculus of the process. Cromwell knows the trial is a formality. The real battle is convincing the king and the public that the Queen is monstrous, thereby justifying the political act of her removal. The Black Book, once finalised, will be the script for the prosecution, a perfect pre-written tragedy with Anne Boleyn as the star villain. No stone is left unturned, no rumour too petty, so long as it contributes to the overall required conclusion of guilty. As Cromwell finally signs off on the completed dossier, you realise the immense power one man can wield in an absolute monarchy. He has taken the king's passing dissatisfaction, shaped it with his own ambition, and forged a document of death. The pages of this Black Book are more dangerous than any sword because they deliver a death sentence with the terrifying legitimacy of the law. The next step in this horrible drama is the public accusation, the official presentation of these fabricated charges, including the most scandalous one of all. The air in London is now thick with the stench of fear and rumour. The whispers that began as a faint, distant hum have coalesced into a terrifying roar as the official indictments are prepared. You are now privy to the moment the charges against Anne Boleyn are formally drawn up, and you observe the horrifying, calculated cruelty of the accusations. If the charges of simple adultery were shocking, the addition of the incest charge is a devastating act of political vandalism, a deliberate move to ensure Anne's and her family's utter ruin. The Bill of Indictment is a lengthy, sprawling document that lists the supposed crimes. It carefully details the charges of high treason committed by Anne, not just with 4 courtiers, but with the 5th and most central figure, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, her own beloved brother. This is a mainstream historical fact that sent shockwaves through Europe. The charge of incest with one sibling was not just a moral horror, it was a crime against nature, designed to make Anne appear not merely adulterous, but monstrous, depraved, and an instrument of the devil. You lean in and read the precise language of the document. It alleges that Anne, despising her lawful husband, the king, and following her frail and carnal appetites, did procure, incite, and entice sundry of the king's daily and familiar servants to be her adulterers and concubines. But the truly poisonous section focuses on George. The indictment accuses Anne and George of having carnal knowledge of each other, on divers days. and that they had also conspired together to plot the king's death, driven by their shared incestuous passion and a desire to see George's child on the throne, an outrageous fabrication. The purpose of this grotesque accusation is chillingly clear. It serves a double purpose for Henry VIII. First, it maximises the horror of Anne's betrayal, making her seem so evil that the public would accept her rapid demise. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it directly attacks the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth. If Anne was a morally corrupted woman capable of sleeping with her own brother, it cast an inescapable shadow over her entire marriage and motherhood, reinforcing the king's political narrative that the marriage had always been cursed and invalid in God's eyes. You recall the earlier image of the Black Book being compiled by Cromwell. The incest charge, a crucial component of that dossier, was almost certainly based on the flimsiest of hearsay, possibly originating from the testimony of George's estranged wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford was forced into an impossible position, and, in a shocking, quirky or fringe tidbit of the saga, some historical accounts suggest she may have provided statements about the unusual closeness and frequent, intimate conversations between Anne and George. Perhaps they were too familiar by court standards, discussing marital matters or political secrets in George's bedchamber, but Cromwell twisted this closeness into evidence of a physical relationship. The fact that the accusation of incest came to light so quickly, and was used so devastatingly, suggests a pre-planned legal manoeuvre, rather than a sudden discovery of fact. It's an act of cold, calculated character assassination. The other four accused men are pawns in this grand strategy. Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, was the most significant, a trusted confidant of the king. His removal signalled that the treason extended to Henry's innermost circle. Francis Weston and William Brereton, young and handsome courtiers, were included to suggest Anne's insatiable, widespread lust. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the critical confessed witness, and his lower social status was used to emphasise Anne's supposed degradation. None of these men, Norris accepted, held significant political power, but they were sufficient to create the appearance of a widespread conspiracy. You feel a sense of profound injustice as you consider Lord Rochford's situation. George was a cultured, witty, and politically astute man. He was known for his sharp tongue and intellectual debates. The tragedy is amplified by the sheer impossibility of the charge. Most contemporaries found the incest accusation utterly unbelievable. Historians still argue whether George Boleyn could have saved his life had he simply confessed to the lesser charge of adultery, even falsely. It is often hypothesized that the king or Cromwell offered him a way out, but his refusal was based on a combination of honour, his belief in his sisters and his own innocence, and perhaps an underestimation of Henry's vengeful determination. By standing his ground and fighting the charge, he ensured his death, but perhaps preserved his moral legacy. Imagine the atmosphere in the Tower as these indictments are read to the prisoners. The charges are so fantastical, so lurid, that they must have initially provoked confused denial, not fear. Anne, upon hearing the charge involving her brother, must have realised the depth of the king's hatred. It was no longer about a failed marriage. It was about the complete erasure of the Boleyn family's legacy. Cromwell's meticulous preparation ensures that the document is legally flawless, even if factually vacuous. The sheer bulk and terrifying legal language create a powerful psychological effect. By the time the indictment is presented to the grand jury in Middlesex and Kent, it is already accepted as fact, simply because it bears the royal seal and the weight of the king's authority. The grand jury, composed of a local gentleman beholden to the crown, returned a true bill on the charges, effectively validating Cromwell's political fiction and allowing the case to proceed to the main trial. As you turn the corner on this terrible journey, you realise that the trial itself will be nothing more than a formal reading of this document. The real tragedy is that Anne and her brother must fight not just legal charges, but a massive state-sponsored smear campaign designed to dehumanise and discredit them before a single word of defence can be uttered. The whispers of incest have now been formally enshrined as law, and the scaffold is being prepared in the shadow of this monstrous lie. The king's patience did not just snap, it metastasised into an act of supreme political tyranny. You are now transported to a darker, more claustrophobic corner of the Tower, where the true heart of Cromwell's case lies, not in the Queen's chambers, but in the cell of a talented yet low-born man, Mark Smeaton, the court musician. Smeaton's confession, is the single, tangible piece of evidence that transforms this entire political hit job into a legally defensible trial for high treason. Without it, the Crown has only rumour. With it, they have a purported admission of guilt. Smeaton, a mainstream historical fact you must grasp, was a commoner, unlike the four other men who were gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. This difference in social standing was Smeaton's undoing. While the noblemen were immune from torture under English law unless condemned, a commoner like Smeaton was not. You feel the damp, cold dread of his confinement. He was the weakest link, the most easily broken, and Cromwell's agents applied immense pressure. Whether this involved the rack, the threat of it, or psychological coercion, a promise of life for a confession, is debated. But the result was the same. A signature on a document admitting to carnal knowledge with the Queen. The confession itself is a masterpiece of legal and political manoeuvring. You watch as the document is drafted, containing the precise dates and places of Smeaton's supposed trysts with Anne, details that lend the charge an air of dreadful authenticity. He reportedly admitted to sleeping with the Queen 3 times. This admission serves as the necessary legal predicate for the treason charge against all the accused. If the Queen slept with one man, she could have plotted with all of them, thereby committing treason by corrupting the royal succession. A profoundly chilling, quirky, or fringe tidbit is that Smeaton was the only one of the accused men who was manacled and interrogated prior to the trial. Furthermore, when he confessed, he was not instantly freed, nor did his sentence reflect any leniency, save the method of his execution. This suggests that his confession was less about securing a pardon and more about serving as a temporary coerced political tool. If the confession were truly voluntary and accurate, why did Cromwell, a pragmatic man, not use it to save Smeaton and solidify the evidence? His execution, too, was a necessary act to ensure he could never recant his testimony in public. He was silenced, but his words remained. You watch as the news of the confession travels through the court and back to Anne in her prison. It is a psychological hammer blow. Anne, fiercely proud of her status, would have been deeply insulted by the suggestion she would stoop to an affair with a mere musician. Her reported distress over Smeaton's confession, which she described as proof of his weakness or madness, was interpreted by her jailers as guilt. You see how every reaction, every denial, every tear is carefully recorded and twisted to fit the narrative of a manipulative, desperate traitor. The true treacherous nature of Smeaton's confession is that it was likely forged or coerced under duress, a point historians still argue whether Smeaton's confession was wholly fabricated by Cromwell's team or extracted under torture with the promise of a merciful death. The consensus leans towards the latter, suggesting Smeaton was broken to serve the state's purpose. Regardless of the method, the testimony was treated as gospel truth by the prosecution, providing the necessary factual weight to counter the denials of the nobleman. A nobleman's word in a court of law typically carried more weight than a commoner's, but Smeaton's sworn statement, however obtained, was the key that unlocked the judicial murder of the Queen. You realise the profound injustice inflicted upon Smeaton himself. He was a gifted musician, drawn into the dangerous orbit of royal favour, only to be consumed by the machinations of the state. His only crime was perhaps being ambitious, or perhaps simply being known to the Queen. His signature on the confession condemned not only himself but also a Queen and 4 gentlemen to death. He became the unwitting, tragic figure whose single act of weakness or fear became the foundation of one of the greatest political scandals in English history. The subsequent arrests of the 4 gentlemen, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Lord Rochford, were purely to give the appearance of a widespread plot, lending credibility to Smeaton's isolated testimony. Cromwell's legal strategy was akin to a house of cards. Smeaton's confession was the base, and the rest of the charges were stacked on top. If Smeaton had recanted or refused to confess, the entire structure would have collapsed, and the king would have been left with nothing but an ugly political problem. The tragedy deepens when you consider the political climate. The king needed more than just a divorce. He needed a justification for why he should be allowed to marry again so quickly. The charge of high treason, cemented by Smeaton's confession, ensured that Henry could execute Anne, marry Jane Seymour less than 2 weeks later, and maintain his absolute authority without significant challenge. The forged nature of the key evidence simply underscores the cynical reality of power in Tudor England. You watch as Cromwell reviews the final copy of Smeaton's deposition, his expression impassive. He holds the death warrant for 5 people and a queen in his hand, masquerading as a judicial document. This is a moment of pure, terrifying administrative ruthlessness. The Black Book is complete, the evidence, such as it is secured, and the stage is now set for the formal trial. The next step is to ensure the jury, the men who will deliver the verdict, are as compliant as Smeaton was broken. The air of political manoeuvring now thickens, moving from the dark cells and ministerial chambers to the cold calculus of judicial selection. With the indictments prepared and Smeaton's coerced confession secured, the next critical step for Thomas Cromwell is to ensure the final verdict is not left to chance. You're now observing the meticulous, ruthless process of selecting the peers who will sit in judgment of Queen Anne, the shadow jury. This is a critical, mainstream historical fact. The trial of a peer of the realm, and especially a queen, was conducted not by a common jury, but by a select group of noblemen, the peers. The selection of these 26 peers of the realm, overseen by Cromwell and the king, was perhaps the most crucial act of judicial rigging in the entire saga. These men were not chosen for their impartiality or wisdom. They were chosen for their absolute loyalty to Henry VIII, and in many cases their existing personal or political animosity towards Anne Boleyn and her family. You look over the list of names, feeling the weight of their combined influence and bias. The panel is chaired by Anne's own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who was appointed Lord High Steward for the trial. This is a deliberate, cruel stroke of genius by the Crown. Norfolk, a powerful conservative and a devout Catholic, had always resented Anne, his niece, for the humiliation her rise had brought upon his family when she replaced his other niece, Catherine Howard. By forcing him to preside, Henry ensured the judgment would be delivered by a man with a direct personal interest in seeing Anne disgraced and removed, and whose loyalty to the king superseded any sense of kinship. It's an act of profound betrayal that you watch unfold with chilling clarity. The rest of the jury is similarly stacked. You recognise names like Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, the king's dearest friend and brother-in-law. Suffolk would never contradict Henry's will, and his presence guarantees a vote for guilty. There are also nobles who owed their titles and lands to the king, and others who were known opponents of Anne's religious leanings and her perceived political influence. This assembly is not a jury of Anne's peers. It is a carefully curated instrument of the king's will. A striking, quirky or fringe tidbit of the day concerning this selection is the subtle pressure applied to those who might waver. Every peer understood the unspoken contract. A not guilty verdict would not only defy the king, but would be seen as an act of treason against Henry's desire to marry Jane Seymour and secure his male heir. The political atmosphere was so toxic that voting to acquit Anne would instantly turn the peer into an enemy of the crown, potentially losing his lands, title, and even his life. The courtroom was saturated with fear long before the trial even began. Every man on that panel knew his own survival depended on delivering the predetermined result. Cromwell's planning extends even to the physical seating arrangements and the pomp of the occasion. The entire event is designed to appear legitimate and imposing, masking the hollow core of the evidence. By selecting a high number of peers, 26 where a smaller number might have served, he created an overwhelming consensus. No single man could stand up against this massive collective judgment. Historians still argue whether any of the assembled peers genuinely believed in Anne's guilt, or if they were merely acting out of self-preservation. It is commonly accepted that few, if any, believed the incest charge, which was seen as ludicrous even at the time. Yet, they all signed off on the conviction. This highlights the terrifying reality of an absolute monarchy. When the king demands a verdict, the law becomes merely a theatrical performance used to sanitize a political execution. The legal fiction must be maintained to demonstrate that justice, however twisted, was done. You sense the profound humiliation this assembly must represent to Anne. She will face not just her legal accusers, but a gallery of men, some of whom she had personally antagonized, others who were her family, and all of whom had benefited from her downfall. It is a public shaming designed to strip away her dignity before the axe strips away her life. She is forced to rely on the honour of men who have long since traded integrity for survival. The judicial process itself is fundamentally flawed. In Tudor treason trials, the accused was not allowed counsel, could not call witnesses to defend themselves, and often had no prior access to the specific charges until the trial began. Anne Boleyn was, by design, going into a fight with both hands tied behind her back, facing a tribunal already decided upon her guilt. This shadow jury is the final piece of Cromwell's puzzle. He secured the evidence, Smeaton, the legal authority, the King's command, and now the judges. The trial is now simply a procedural formality. The sheer efficiency and cold detachment of the process are terrifying. It is a perfect mechanism for state-sponsored murder, dressed in the finest legal robes. As the peers prepare to take their seats in the Great Hall of the Tower, you feel the tension mounting. The atmosphere is not one of impending justice, but of a calculated sacrifice about to be enacted. Every bow, every ceremonial gesture, every solemn oath is a lie. The King's desire is their command, and the fate of Anne Boleyn has been sealed long before she ever sets foot in the courtroom. The stage is set for the most scandalous and perhaps the most cynical trial in English history. You leave the selection rooms and enter the Great Hall within the Tower of London, a space now transformed from a majestic dining hall into a stage for judicial ruin. This is where the infamous trial of Queen Anne Boleyn and her brother George, Lord Rochford, will unfold on May 15th, 1536. The room is vast, high-ceilinged, and feels suffocatingly grand, its medieval stone walls seemingly absorbing the collective dread. The very atmosphere is charged with formality and a terrifying sense of inevitability. The setup itself is a meticulous piece of theatre, a mainstream historical fact designed to emphasise the majesty of the King's justice, even as it serves his vengeance. At the head of the hall is a large elevated dais, where the Duke of Norfolk sits, bearing the white staff of the Lord High Steward, a chilling visual reminder of his unwelcome role as both judge and betrayer. Below him are arranged the 26 peers of the realm, the shadow jury you watched being selected, their faces a mixture of forced solemnity and nervous apprehension. Every man there knows he is participating in a drama where the lines are fixed and the ending is certain. You trudge through the assembled crowd. The audience is small, exclusive and hand-picked. Only high-ranking officials and a few privileged ambassadors are permitted entry, largely to ensure that the message of the King's absolute power is correctly transmitted back to the courts of Europe. You feel the heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of expensive fabrics and the occasional cough. It is less a courtroom and more a carefully controlled spectacle, designed to intimidate the accused and sanitize the political execution that is about to occur. The benches designated for the prosecution lawyers are overflowing with documents, the infamous Black Book, the coerced confession of Mark Smeaton, and the meticulously drafted indictments. The Crown is represented by a formidable team, armed with the law, and more importantly the King's backing. Their confidence is palpable. They know they hold all the cards, including the final one. Now, focus on the prisoner's dock. It is set low, directly facing the tribunal, designed to make the accused look up at their judges. It is here that Anne Boleyn will stand, a queen reduced to a common prisoner. The symbolism is inescapable. She is physically lower than the men who will decide her fate. You feel the cold air on the stone floor, an unnerving contrast to the brilliant silks worn by the judges. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the trial's staging is the deliberate exclusion of any foreign dignitaries known to be favourable to Anne or the new Queen of France. The court ensured that the only ambassadors present, notably the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, were men who were already hostile to Anne. Chapuis, a man who loathed the Queen, would be the primary foreign source for information about the trial. By controlling the audience, Henry and Cromwell controlled the narrative that would spread across Europe, ensuring that even the global view of the trial was prejudiced against Anne. The emotional atmosphere is one of profound hypocrisy. Every man in the hall, from Norfolk down, understands the charges are tenuous and the trial is rigged. Yet they participate with grim determination. This is not about truth. It is about power. It's about demonstrating that even a queen, the king's own wife, is subject to the supreme will of the monarch if she falls out of favour. The trial is a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and status in the Tudor court. Historians still argue whether the entire formality of the trial was necessary, given that Henry had absolute power to simply execute her by royal decree. The consensus is that Henry needed the legal validation to maintain his image as a just king, guided by the law of the land and not mere tyrannical impulse. The trial, however flimsy, provided the necessary veneer of a legal process, transforming what would have been a murder into a just execution for high treason. The public must believe that the Queen was truly monstrous for the king to so quickly discard her and marry again. The stage for ruin had to be meticulously constructed. You stand there, feeling the history of the place. So many famous and infamous figures have passed through this hall, many to their deaths. Yet, the trial of a crowned queen, the mother of the future monarch, stands apart in its calculated cruelty. The sheer audacity of the king's move, to not only discard her but to utterly annihilate her reputation and life through a legal fiction, is breathtaking. The silence deepens. A sudden stir at the far door announces the arrival of the accused. First, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, is escorted in to face his separate but linked trial. You see his composure, his intellectual bearing, a man ready to fight a legal battle he knows is unwinnable. Then, the heavy, dreadful moment, the entrance of the Queen herself. The stage is fully set. The audience holds its collective breath, anticipating the spectacle of a queen's downfall. The vast, cavernous great hall of the tower falls into a terrified silence. The stage for ruin is fully prepared, and now you witness the entrance of the principal actor, Queen Anne Boleyn. She's escorted to the low dock, her final, isolated stand. This moment, May 15th, 1536, is etched forever in the tragic timeline of Tudor England. You watch as Anne walks, not with the frantic desperation of a common prisoner, but with a calculated, almost eerie composure. She is dressed, not in sombre black, but in a rich dark gown, perhaps crimson, a vibrant and defiant choice meant to signify her queenly status and her refusal to silently accept the role of the defeated woman. This decision to maintain her regal dignity is a crucial mainstream historical fact. She understood that even in defeat, the manner of her surrender mattered immensely to her legacy. She's performing a queen's role to the very end, demonstrating to the hostile court and the few spectators that her spirit, if not her life, remains unconquered. As she's positioned in the dock, you feel the intense, focused gaze of the assembled peers, especially her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, seated high above her. It is a moment of crushing isolation. She is denied the comfort of her friends, her ladies, most of whom are now enemies or spies, and most brutally her husband, the king, who is conspicuously and cowardly absent. She stands utterly alone, relying only on her own intellect and reserves of pride. Her first act is to curtsy deeply to the court, a traditional gesture of respect, but in this context it carries a heavy layer of irony. It's a subtle assertion of her rank, reminding everyone present that they are passing judgment not on a courtesan or a minor noble, but on a Queen of England. You observe her posture, erect, her head held high. You know she's terrified, yet she projects an image of defiant innocence. This composure is strategically important, challenging the prosecution's narrative of a wildly promiscuous and emotionally unhinged conspirator. A fascinating, quirky or fringe tidbit concerns Anne's choice of reading material in the days leading up to the trial. Reportedly, she was engrossed in the book of Job from the Bible, the story of a righteous man suffering undeserved torment. This detail, though small, speaks volumes about her mindset. She viewed herself as the victim of unjust affliction, sent by God to test her faith, or perhaps simply the victim of a jealous, vengeful king. She saw herself as a martyr, already preparing the framework for her post-mortem defence. This spiritual preparation fueled the composed demeanour you are witnessing now. The sheer atmosphere of the hall is designed to break her. The judges are her enemies, the spectators are hostile, and the lawyers are armed with lies. Yet, Anne maintains eye contact, refusing to appear shifty or distraught. She's keenly aware that any sign of weakness or hysteria will be interpreted as an admission of guilt. This calculated self-control is her only weapon against the overwhelming legal and political power marshalled against her. You sense that Anne's biggest challenge is not the legal charges, but the moral narrative. The prosecution wants to paint her as a wicked seductress and a traitor. By entering with dignity and composure, she immediately complicates that narrative. She forces the court to deal with her not as a demon, but as a queen who is demanding to be judged fairly, even though she knows fairness is impossible. You consider the great irony of her situation. She was, in many ways, an agent of the revolutionary change that brought Thomas Cromwell to power and allowed Henry VIII to break with the Catholic Church. She helped dismantle the old system, and now that very system, retooled and wielded by her former ally, is being used to destroy her. She's caught in the gears of the machine she helped construct. Historians still argue whether Anne had any realistic expectation of acquittal, or if her defiant posture was purely for posterity and principle. Given the composition of the jury and the king's openly expressed desire to be rid of her, most scholars conclude that acquittal was never possible. Her defence, therefore, was less about securing a not guilty verdict, and more about undermining the legitimacy of the process itself, and crucially preserving the honour of her daughter, Elizabeth. She had to fight the charges of treason and incest to protect her child's future status, even if that fight was purely symbolic. As the formalities begin, and the clerk rises to read the full, dreadful list of accusations, the moment of her public humiliation, Anne Boleyn remains standing tall. She's alone in the dock, but in that moment, her solitude seems to project a power greater than the collective will of the fearful peers arrayed against her. She waits for the reading of the indictment, a chilling mix of truth, exaggeration, and outright falsehood that will attempt to strip her of her crown, her life, and her reputation. She is a woman on the edge of a precipice, staring down her own executioners. The silence in the great hall of the tower is now absolute, heavy, and expectant. You stand with Anne Boleyn in the prisoner's dock as the Crown's representative. Likely the Attorney General rises to read the bill of indictment. This is the moment where the political whispers and Cromwell's calculated fabrications are formally enshrined as law against the Queen. The reading of this document is a mainstream historical fact, a chilling performance that stunned the few spectators with its breadth and audacity. The clerk's voice, dry and monotonous, begins to recite the list of high treasons and misdemeanours. The indictment is not just a formal charge, it is a lengthy, sprawling narrative of moral depravity and political conspiracy. You hear the accusations tumbling forth, one after another, each more incredible than the last. They begin with the general charge that Anne, despising her marriage to the king, had seduced and incited 5 men, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, to be her lovers. The most shocking element is the specificity of the charges, coupled with their deliberate vagueness. The indictment claims the adulterous acts occurred on divers days and times, between October 1533 and the arrest in May 1536. This is a subtle but cruel legal tactic you recall from the Black Book's construction, the use of broad timeframes to deny the accused any chance of providing solid alibis. Yet, the document then details specific alleged dates, turning ordinary courtly interactions into treasonous trysts. You hear the names of royal residences, Greenwich, Whitehall, Hampton Court, places that should have been sanctuaries, now branded as scenes of clandestine criminality. For instance, the clerk reads that Anne promised Henry Norris she would marry him after the king's death, presenting a supposed motive for plotting regicide. It claims she gave him gifts and money, transforming acts of patronage or simple courtly generosity into proof of a secret pact. You feel the absurdity of the claims, yet understand the power of their formal presentation. The sheer volume of accusations is designed to overwhelm the court and confuse the defendant. It's a classic legal shotgun approach. Fire enough charges, and the court will inevitably accept some of the damage. Then comes the gut punch, the incest charge. The clerk reads aloud the allegation that Anne and her brother, driven by their carnal appetites, had committed incestuous acts, and together had conspired to poison the king and usurp the throne. The inclusion of this charge is so extreme it serves a secondary horrifying purpose, to make the adultery charge seem comparatively minor. The spectators, few as they are, gasp at the sheer monstrosity of the claim. You notice the Duke of Norfolk shifts uncomfortably in his seat, forced to listen to the public vilification of his own blood. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this part of the trial is the focus on linguistic evidence. The indictment makes specific reference to Anne telling Henry Norris to go to the king's closet in the morning, which was twisted into a coded message for a rendezvous. She also allegedly told Weston that Norris often came to her chamber before she was up, a seemingly innocent court observation that was warped into a late-night assignation. The prosecution turned every ambiguous phrase, every courtly joke, and every moment of light-hearted banter into coded language for a high treasonous conspiracy. This revealed the sheer lack of physical proof, forcing the Crown to rely entirely on twisted semantics. As the reading concludes, a cloud of confusion mixed with revulsion hangs over the hall. The reality is that the Crown provided absolutely no concrete evidence, no letters, no eyewitnesses to the acts of adultery, and certainly no proof of a conspiracy to murder Henry. They relied almost entirely on Mark Smeaton's coerced confession, which was simply summarised, and the testimony of Lady Rochford and others who provided only circumstantial hearsay. Historians still argue whether the prosecutors themselves genuinely believed the incest charge, or if it was inserted purely to ensure the conviction and annulment. Most lean toward the latter. The crime was too abhorrent, too impossible to be true, and yet, legally, it was the most effective means of destroying Anne's reputation beyond repair and guaranteeing that Henry could never be forced to take her back. By painting her as a monster, Henry solidified his own position as a wronged but righteous sovereign. You watch as Anne listens to the litany of her alleged sins. Her composure, which was so striking upon her entrance, is severely tested. You see her eyes flash with indignation, and a slight flush rise on her cheeks. She knows that this is not a search for truth, it is a public defamation, delivered under the authority of law. The sheer, concentrated volume of the accusations, treason, adultery, incest, and conspiracy, is designed to bury her before she can even speak in her defence. This moment is the pivot point of the trial. The Crown has laid out its case, and it is a case built on political necessity, not legal fact. The challenge for Anne, and more immediately her brother George, who is tried first, is how to dismantle this towering edifice of lies with nothing but their word and their wits against the king's unstoppable legal machinery. The odds are impossible, but the fight for their honour is about to begin. The reading of the indictment, a torrent of fabricated depravity, has concluded, leaving an echoing silence in the great hall. The first of the accused to face the tribunal is Anne's brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. His trial is heard first, and you stand with Anne, watching this pivotal moment, knowing that her brother's defence, however brilliant, is likely a performance for a doomed cause. His fate is inextricably linked to hers. He must destroy the incest charge to save his own life, and perhaps create a crack in the Crown's armour for his sister. You observe Lord Rochford's demeanour. Unlike the other accused men who are tried separately by a common jury, George, as a peer, faces the same tribunal as Anne. He is composed, a sharp contrast to the legal onslaught he just endured. He is known as a man of formidable intellect, an accomplished poet and scholar, and he approaches his defence not with frantic denial, but with the cool, logical precision of a debater. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Lord Rochford's defence was so intellectually forceful that it momentarily stunned the prosecution and impressed the few witnesses. His strategy focused on two key areas: the charge of incest and the alleged conspiracy to plot the king's death. You listen as he addresses the incest charge, the most heinous of all. He uses a masterful technique. He challenges the prosecution to produce any evidence, any specific witness, or even the date and location of the alleged act. He points out the absurdity of the claim, arguing that he and the Queen were almost never alone, and that any undue familiarity was purely within the bounds of a close, politically minded sibling relationship. He uses scripture and logic, demonstrating the legal and moral impossibility of the crime. A chilling, quirky or fringe tidbit of the day illustrates the intellectual nature of his defence. When the prosecution relied heavily on the ambiguous testimony of Lady Rochford regarding a discussion between the siblings about the king's impotence, George turned the tables. He reportedly cited a legal or rhetorical precedent. Some accounts claim a classical passage, others an obscure anecdote, that required two witnesses for such a grave accusation, something the prosecution could not provide for the act itself. Furthermore, he argued that a conversation about a personal matter between siblings, even if indelicate, does not constitute treason or incest. His defence was so compelling that the prosecution was reportedly forced to bring a man named Richard Page from the court to secretly report details of George's words to the king, as Henry was desperately worried that Rochford might actually sway the jury. You feel a glimmer of hope. George's eloquence has momentarily broken the monolithic confidence of the prosecution. The air is suddenly tense with uncertainty, a terrifying feeling for the peers who are meant to deliver a quick, preordained verdict. This is the only moment in the entire set of trials where the Crown's case appeared genuinely vulnerable. Historians still argue whether George Boleyn could have been acquitted had he not been simultaneously charged with the lesser, but still treasonous, charge of conspiring the king's death. It is often posited that his compelling defence against incest was undermined by the more general charge of plotting the king's demise, which was supported by the flimsiest of hearsay, statements Anne had allegedly made in frustration that he supposedly failed to report. The two charges combined created an inescapable legal web. Rochford's brilliance might have saved him from the accusation of incest, but the king's desire to eliminate a political threat was satisfied by the treason charge. You watch as the prosecution, regaining its footing, resorts to aggressive counter-argument and ultimately the weight of the king's authority. They constantly refer back to Smeaton's confession, using it as the foundational evidence that if adultery was committed with one man, the subsequent charges against all others, including the brother, must logically follow. The defence cannot cross-examine Smeaton, who is not present in court, further highlighting the procedural injustice. In his final address, Lord Rochford makes an impassioned plea, not for mercy, but for justice and honour. He asserts his innocence and subtly challenges the peers to put their conscience before their fear of the king. It is a brave, almost suicidal act of defiance. The peers withdraw briefly to consider their verdict. The weight is excruciating. You see the stress etched on Anne's face. She knows her brother is fighting for both of them. When the peers return, their faces are grim. The Duke of Norfolk, visibly uncomfortable but utterly beholden to his king, announces the verdict. Guilty. Lord Rochford is found guilty of high treason. His eloquence, his logic, and his courage were utterly meaningless against the fixed determination of the king and the political fear of the jury. He receives his sentence with dignity, his final words recorded as a prayer for the king and an acceptance of his unjust fate. You realise that if George, with his intellect and powerful defence, could not escape, Anne's own chances are non-existent. The shadow jury delivered their expected verdict, sealing both their fates. The stage is now ready for Anne's personal battle against the insurmountable odds. The devastating verdict against George Boleyn hangs like a shroud over the Great Hall. The hope that flickered momentarily during her brother's defence has been brutally extinguished. Now it is Queen Anne Boleyn's turn to stand trial, and you watch her transition from a grieving sister to a calculating defender of her own life and honour. She knows her cause is lost, but her final battle is for her reputation and the legitimacy of her daughter. Anne rises from the dock to address her accusers. Her defence is a masterclass in composed defiance and legal intelligence, a crucial mainstream historical fact that shocked the few witnesses present. Remember that she had no legal counsel, no access to her witnesses, and no prior knowledge of the precise charges beyond the general indictment. Yet she used her sharp wit, honed over years of courtly manoeuvring and political intrigue, to systematically challenge the flimsy evidence presented by the prosecution. Her strategy is not to deny every flirtation or every private conversation. That would be impossible given the twisted nature of court gossip, but to challenge the interpretation of those actions. She does not engage in emotional pleas. She uses logic, demanding proof for the impossible charges. You listen as she zeroes in on the most vulnerable parts of the Crown's case. She addresses the accusations involving the four gentlemen, turning their supposed affections into common courtly compliments. When the prosecution cites a piece of damning hearsay, that she asked Henry Norris why he did not marry, she coolly responds with a different version of the conversation, turning an alleged seduction into a simple, chaste inquiry about his future. When they claim she gave gifts to Weston and Brereton as tokens of illicit love, she states they were standard gifts of royal patronage, publicly given and not at all clandestine. The heart of her defence is the dismantling of Mark Smeaton's confession. You watch her scornfully reject the notion that she would lower herself to the level of a common musician. Her pride, though perhaps arrogant, serves her well here. She implies that a queen would never risk her crown, her life, and her child's legitimacy for a low-born man. While she cannot call Smeaton to the stand to force a recantation, she challenges the jury to consider the extreme improbability of the claim, highlighting the social gulf between them. A profound, quirky, or fringe tidbit of the trial is Anne's brilliant use of rhetoric against the incest charge. While her brother failed to sway the jury, Anne used the accusation's sheer monstrosity as a shield. By expressing utter repugnance for the crime, which was likely genuine, she subtly implied that a woman capable of such a horror would also be capable of the other crimes, thereby painting the entire indictment as one continuous monstrous lie. She dared the jurors to believe that she was so unnatural, knowing full well the Conservative peers would find the incest charge as morally repellent as she claimed to. It was a high-risk gamble to use the most damaging charge as a rhetorical tool. Her cross-examination of the evidence is forensic, focusing on the lack of dates, locations, and credible, uncoerced witnesses. She asks, where are the proofs? Where are the witnesses to these terrible crimes? Why are they not brought before me to swear to my face? She knows the answer. There are no such witnesses, or they are too terrified to speak the truth. Historians still argue whether the manner of Anne's defence, her composure, her intellect, and her refusal to break down actually infuriated her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, making him more likely to push for a harsh sentence. Norfolk and the Conservative faction resented Anne's sharp wit and political acumen, traits they considered unwomanly and dangerous. Her brilliant defence, rather than saving her, may have simply confirmed their existing view of her as an overly clever, challenging and disruptive queen who needed to be silenced permanently. You see her stand there, a singular figure against the legal might of a kingdom. She is, in a very real sense, representing herself and the concept of due process against a system bent entirely on the king's will. The contrast between her reasoned arguments and the prosecution's reliance on fear and rumour is stark. Despite her eloquent effort, the outcome is never in doubt. She cannot dismantle the foundation of the case, which is political necessity. The king needed her gone, and the jury was too afraid to challenge that royal prerogative. Her composure may have saved her dignity, but it cannot save her life. Her words hang in the air, brilliant but ultimately impotent against the cold, hard reality of absolute power. She has shown them how a queen faces ruin, and in doing so she has secured her moral victory, even as she awaits the inevitable verdict. With Anne Boleyn's brilliant and composed counter-arguments hanging in the air, the prosecution now has the unenviable task of rebutting her defence. You watch the Crown's lawyers and the assembled peers, feeling the immense pressure they are under. Their case must not only secure a conviction, but also survive the intellectual scrutiny that Anne, and briefly her brother, brought to bear. This phase of the trial exposes the utter hollowness of the legal framework built by Cromwell. The Crown's rebuttal is a stark, mainstream historical fact of the trial. It rests almost entirely on hearsay, inference, and the coerced confession of Mark Smeaton. They present no letters, no witnesses to the actual acts of adultery, and no physical proof of a conspiracy to harm the king. This glaring absence of genuine proof is the core scandal of the trial. The Crown's argument is essentially, because the king believes she is guilty, and because one man confessed, the rest must follow. Must. You listen as the prosecution drones on, attempting to re-establish the narrative that Anne was a promiscuous, power-hungry queen who sought to control the succession by taking multiple lovers. They rely heavily on the ambiguous testimony of Lady Rochford and others who were either enemies of Anne or terrified into compliance. Every piece of evidence is circumstantial, transformed into certainty only by the authority of the king's will. For example, when Anne countered the charge that she had told Henry Norris that she wished the king was dead, the prosecution simply reasserted that the words were spoken, and regardless of her intent, the utterance itself constituted high treason, as it demonstrated a desire for the monarch's demise. They weaponized the law itself, reminding the peers that merely imagining the king's death is a capital offence. This is a terrifying legal manoeuvre. They don't have to prove she acted. They only have to prove a treasonable thought. The key moment of the prosecution's case is the forceful reintroduction of Mark Smeaton's confession. Since Smeaton is not present, a convenient legal absence that prevents Anne from confronting her only direct accuser, the prosecution relies on the written, signed deposition. They present this document as irrefutable fact, emphasising Smeaton's alleged guilt as the foundational proof that adultery did occur. You hear them argue that Smeaton, a simple musician, had no political motive to lie, and was simply driven by an honest confession of his sin. This is a transparently false argument, but it provides the peers with the necessary legal cover to convict. A bizarre, quirky or fringe tidbit of the prosecution's method is the use of the Queen's supposed lack of maternal warmth as a form of moral evidence. They presented statements suggesting Anne was overly concerned with fashion and court frivolity, and not enough with the state of her soul or the welfare of the king. This was a subtle but vicious tactic designed to prejudice the jury not against a legal defendant, but against a flawed woman. By casting doubt on her morality and piety, they made the specific charges of incest and adultery seem more plausible within the context of a morally corrupted personality. The prosecution's ultimate weapon, which they employ with crushing finality, is the fear of the king. They subtly but constantly remind the peers of the political situation. The realm desperately needs a male heir. The king desires a new, presumably legitimate marriage, and Anne stands as an insurmountable obstacle. The unspoken message is clear. Acquitting Anne is an act of treason against the king's will and the stability of the Tudor dynasty. The trial is not about the law, it is about survival. Historians still argue whether Anne's refusal to concede any fault, even a minor non-capital offence that might have mollified Henry, was an act of supreme principle or political miscalculation. Many scholars believe that had she admitted to some indiscretion, short of adultery or treason, Henry might have been content with an annulment and banishment, sparing her life. But her resolute denial of all capital charges forced the prosecution to push for execution to validate their entire flimsy legal case. By proving her guilty of high treason, they justified Henry's desire to destroy her and marry again immediately. The Crown's case concludes not with a flourish of conclusive evidence, but with a weighty pronouncement. The charges are true, the king is wronged, and the stability of the realm requires her conviction. The prosecution leaves the peers with a choice: risk the king's wrath and challenge his legal fiction, or simply accept the predetermined verdict and survive. The lack of genuine proof only underscores the terrifying reality that in Tudor England the king's desire was the highest law. The prosecution's case, built on sand and cemented with fear, has concluded. The flimsy accusations, the lack of witnesses, and the reliance on a single, coerced confession now stand nakedly exposed, yet the conviction remains certain. You watch as Queen Anne Boleyn, having finished her meticulous dismantling of the Crown's evidence, takes a final, profound stand. This is her last act of public defence, a moment of profound silence and moral weight in the otherwise choreographed chaos of the Great Hall. She rises again, not to argue legal points, but to address the peers on a different plane, the plane of conscience and divine judgment. This is Anne's final plea, a mainstream historical fact that underscores her recognition that the battle was no longer legal, but moral. Her words are measured, dignified, and utterly devoid of the hysteria her accusers might have expected. She speaks directly to the Duke of Norfolk and the 26 peers, appealing not to their sense of law, which has failed her, but to their sense of honour, which she hopes might yet stir. You listen intently, feeling the weight of her desperation. She reiterates her absolute innocence of the specific capital crimes laid against her: adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. She does not deny that she may have been guilty of some indiscretion or given cause for the king's displeasure, a flash of anger, a sharp word, perhaps even jealousy. But she asserts vehemently that these are not capital offences. She knows she cannot argue against the king's displeasure, only against the death sentence it requires. Her plea is structured as a surrender to God's will, a deliberate theological manoeuvre. She states that she places her cause in the hands of the Almighty, from whom no secrets are hidden. This is a subtle but powerful tactic. By invoking God as her ultimate judge, she implies that the human court, acting out of fear and political expediency, is committing a grave sin. She suggests that the peers, in voting for her death, will not merely be pleasing the king, but will be incurring the wrath of heaven. A powerful, quirky or fringe tidbit from this final speech, recorded by later accounts, is her direct statement regarding her virtue. She reportedly asserted that she had always been a true and faithful wife to the king, as far as her frailty allowed, subtly contrasting her own human imperfections with the monstrous crime she was accused of. She knew that the charges against her were so grotesque that they needed to be refuted by an appeal to fundamental human morality, not just legal technicalities. This shift in focus from legal proof to moral truth was her final, calculated move. She then turns her attention to her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. While she cannot speak directly of the child's legitimacy, her concern is palpable. She begs the peers to reflect on how their verdict might unjustly smear the reputation of her child. This maternal plea is intended to prick the conscience of the noblemen, many of whom were fathers themselves, reminding them that their political fear has consequences that stretch far beyond the scaffold. You sense that she is also speaking to Henry VIII, indirectly but piercingly. Her refusal to beg for mercy is crucial. Instead, she requests justice. By demanding justice, she challenges the king's entire fabricated process. She makes it clear that if she is convicted, it will be the result of tyranny and political malice, not of law. This final defiance is her way of ensuring her side of the story is documented, even if the king intends to erase her from history. The silence that follows her speech is heavy with unspoken conviction. Her eloquence, though impressive, is utterly powerless against the fixed will of the crown. The peers, men who had sat in judgment of the evidence, now sit in judgment of their own self-preservation. They are trapped between a queen's demand for conscience and a king's threat to their status and lives. Historians still argue whether Anne's final act of defiance and composure actually made a greater impression on posterity than any confession or tearful surrender would have. Many scholars contend that her dignified exit, her unwavering assertion of innocence, and her refusal to beg for mercy were key to her later reputation as a tragic, unjustly executed victim, rather than a convicted traitor. Her final plea was not for her life, but for her legacy, and in that she was ultimately successful. The Lord High Steward, the Duke of Norfolk, now calls upon the peers to deliberate. This is a mere formality. The verdict was decided the moment the jury list was drawn up, and the indictment was read. You watch as the peers retire, only to return quickly, their faces confirming the inevitable conclusion that has been hanging over the hall since the doors first opened. The brief, tense recess for deliberation ends, and the peers of the realm file back into the great hall. The silence is now not merely heavy, but absolute, charged with the final, crushing inevitability. You watch, standing beside Anne Boleyn in the dock, as the 26 peers take their places. Their faces are set, betraying a mixture of relief that the formality is over and lingering discomfort at the terrible deed they are about to complete. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, Anne's own uncle, rises. He is the Lord High Steward, and it is his duty to deliver the final judgment. The moment is a study in brutal public betrayal. Norfolk is visibly strained, yet his loyalty to the king and his political self-interest far outweigh any familial bond he might feel for his condemned niece. This final act of kinship renunciation is a mainstream historical fact that secured his own continued favour with Henry VIII. The clerk asks each peer, by name, to stand and announce his verdict on the charges of high treason, including adultery, incest and conspiracy to procure the king's death. One by one the 26 noblemen rise. Though the trial was conducted in secret, the outcome had been telegraphed to the court for weeks. You hear the word, repeated again and again like a hammer blow, guilty. There are no dissenting voices. There is no appeal to conscience. The fear of the king, the desire for political stability, and the cynical self-preservation of the noble class have triumphed over justice and truth. Every single peer, including the Duke of Suffolk, the king's brother-in-law and every man present who had benefited from Anne's earlier rise, condemns her to death. The verdict, guilty of all treasons, is unanimous. You feel the cold shock ripple through the hall, even though everyone knew this was coming. It is one thing to anticipate the king's will. It is quite another to hear the legal word that seals a queen's death warrant. The verdict validates Cromwell's entire fabricated legal case. It transforms a political execution into a necessary judicial act, preserving the facade of Henry VIII as a righteous sovereign betrayed by a wicked wife. Anne Boleyn's reaction is a final, astonishing display of defiance. She does not collapse or scream. Instead, a quirkier or fringe tidbit of the trial suggests that she maintained her composure, even offering a faint, almost pitying smile. This was her final psychological weapon, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken. You hear her speak, not in protest, but with an air of sad resignation, stating that since the king now believed her to be guilty, she must accept her fate. Her lack of hysteria was, to many observers, a more powerful declaration of innocence than any frantic plea would have been. Historians still argue whether any of the peers truly wrestled with their conscience before delivering the verdict, or if their decision was made entirely out of fear. While contemporary accounts suggest a heavy atmosphere, there is no evidence of a single vote against conviction. The overwhelming consensus is that challenging the king's desire would have constituted political and financial suicide. They chose their own lives and lands over the life of a queen who had lost the ultimate source of power, the king's affection. Their silence on the flimsiness of the charges speaks volumes about the tyranny lurking beneath the surface of Tudor law. The political implications of the guilty verdict are immediate and profound. It instantly frees the king to pursue his third marriage, validating the charges of treason that would enable a quick execution. More disastrously for her legacy, it legally confirms the charge of incest, transforming Anne from a merely unfaithful wife into a monster in the eyes of the law, thereby permanently tainting the legitimacy of her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. The peers, in their single word, did more than condemn Anne. They attempted to rewrite the history of Henry's first 7 years of marriage. The formal conclusion of this phase of the trial feels abrupt. The political machinery, having ground up its victim, now pauses, ready for the final ceremonial act. The verdict is delivered, the Queen is legally dead, and only the pronouncement of the sentence remains. You watch the peers exchange nervous glances, perhaps realising the terrifying power of the king they serve, a power that can summon 26 of the realm's most powerful men to commit a public act of legal murder. The atmosphere shifts from tense expectancy to a grim finality. Anne stands ready, having lost the battle for her life but won a small moral victory by refusing to acknowledge the guilt of the monstrous crimes. She has maintained her dignity, forcing the court to execute a queen, not a desperate criminal. The sentencing is the inevitable, brutal conclusion to this political drama. The chorus of "guilty" has faded, replaced by a deep, anticipatory silence. Anne Boleyn has been convicted of all treasons. Now comes the moment of the legal annihilation, the formal pronouncement of the sentence. You watch as the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, rises again to fulfil this grim duty. The sheer, concentrated cruelty of this moment is overwhelming. The man who should have been her strongest familial defender is now forced by the king to deliver her death sentence. Norfolk, bearing the heavy white staff of the Lord High Steward, addresses his niece. His voice, though formal, is perhaps laced with a flicker of personal discomfort or even shame, yet it is utterly devoid of mercy. He's acting under the king's express command, placing his duty to Henry above his loyalty to his own bloodline. This moment of crushing betrayal by her uncle is a critical mainstream historical fact. It solidified Norfolk's political standing and distanced him from the Boleyn family's fall. The sentence for high treason in Tudor England was terrifyingly brutal and deliberately degrading. You listen as Norfolk pronounces the sentence. Anne Boleyn is to be taken back to the Tower of London, and there, burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The inclusion of burning as an option is a shocking detail that emphasises the king's vengeful malice. Death by burning was the traditional punishment for heresy or petty treason, such as a wife murdering her husband, and it was the most agonising and public form of execution. By adding this option, the king was essentially equating Anne with a witch, or a common criminal guilty of monstrous betrayal, compounding her humiliation. It was a calculated psychological torture, leaving Anne in agonising uncertainty about her final horrible moments. You see Anne's composure finally waver slightly upon hearing the full, terrible weight of the sentence, particularly the option of burning, yet she quickly regains her control. When she's asked, as was customary, if she has anything to say as to why sentence of death should not be passed upon her, she delivers a measured and powerful final statement. She again asserts her innocence and submits to the king's will, adding a subtle, defiant prayer that she hopes the king's future life will be short and painful if he is unjustly executing her, a chilling aside recorded in later accounts. A profoundly strange, quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the actual method of execution. The sentence of burning or beheading was technically given to allow the king the final choice of mercy. Anne, in her final days, reportedly sent a message to Cromwell asking him to petition the king for the favour of a French swordsman. This was a plea for a cleaner, quicker death than the common English axe, which often required multiple blows. This request, a queen requesting a specific professional executioner, is an incredible blend of dignity and grim practicality in the face of death. Her primary concern was for a swift, dignified end, not a pardon. The moment Norfolk concludes his pronouncement, the trial is officially over. Anne is no longer Queen Anne, but Anne, convicted traitor. The white staff of the Lord High Steward is ritually broken over the prisoner's head, a symbolic act signifying the dissolution of the court and the finality of the judgment. You hear the sharp snap of the wood, a chilling punctuation mark on the end of her life. The role of the Duke of Norfolk is the ultimate testament to the terrifying nature of absolute monarchy. Historians still argue whether Norfolk personally enjoyed his role in Anne's downfall, driven by his conservative politics and deep-seated rivalry with the Boleyn family, or if he was simply a terrified functionary acting on threat. The fact remains that by participating so visibly and ruthlessly, he ensured his own safety and that of his family, cementing his reputation as a man whose loyalty to the crown was absolute, regardless of personal cost. Anne is led away, back into the Tower. Her final walk out of the Great Hall is the end of her life as a public figure and a queen. She has been judicially murdered by a fixed court, and the next few days are simply a countdown to the scaffold. The verdict and sentence were the king's way of publicly validating his desire to be rid of her. But even this act of vengeance is not enough. Before her body can be silenced, her marriage must be annulled, ensuring her daughter is declared illegitimate. The horrific finality of the death sentence is now complete, yet the machinery of annihilation is still turning. Anne Boleyn has been condemned as a traitor and is awaiting execution, but before the axe can fall, the king requires one final, crucial legal manoeuvre. You are now transported away from the Tower's grim halls to the Archbishop of Canterbury's court at Lambeth, where the ecclesiastical side of Anne's destruction is playing out. The goal here is not to condemn Anne's body, but to utterly obliterate her legacy, and most importantly strip her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, of her claim to the throne. If Anne was simply executed as a traitor, her marriage to the king would still technically be valid in the eyes of the church, and Elizabeth would remain Henry's legitimate heir. To clear the path for Jane Seymour's children, the marriage itself must be retroactively declared null and void. This is where Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a man who owed his position entirely to the Boleyn faction, enters the drama. Cranmer, a mainstream historical fact, had been a sincere friend and political ally of Anne. He had risked everything to declare Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon invalid and to solemnise his union with Anne in 1533. Now, he is under immense pressure to undo his own work. You stand in the court at Lambeth Palace, observing the proceedings which take place just 2 days after the death sentence. It is a moment of profound hypocrisy. Cranmer, surrounded by his own judges, sits in a deeply conflicted state. He does not wish to condemn Anne, but his loyalty to God is trumped by his terror of the king. He knows that refusal means his own immediate downfall and likely death. The grounds for annulment are shocking, and a grotesque echo of the Black Book's initial fabrications. The basis is not the alleged adultery or incest, capital crimes that led to her execution, but an obscure, previously ignored, and almost certainly false impediment. The claim that Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, had had an affair with Henry VIII. According to canon law, having carnal knowledge with two sisters was an impediment of affinity that required a papal dispensation for marriage. Henry had obtained such a dispensation in 1533 from the Archbishop, but the current argument is that Anne knew of Henry's prior relations with Mary, deliberately hid the information, and therefore the dispensation was invalid. This is a legal absurdity, a chilling, quirky or fringe tidbit. Anne is being executed for treason, adultery and incest, based on acts she committed during the marriage, and simultaneously, the marriage is being annulled based on an impediment that supposedly existed before the marriage. This legal self-contradiction, declaring her both a traitorous wife and a woman never legally married, is a monument to the king's ruthless legal manipulation. The law is simply whatever Henry VIII needs it to be at any given moment. You watch as Cranmer, under extreme duress, finally pronounces the judgment. He declares, in solemn legal language, that the marriage between King Henry and Anne Boleyn was, and always had been, null and void, due to the previously unconfessed impediment of affinity. This single sentence achieves two primary objectives for the king. First, it legally confirms that Princess Elizabeth is illegitimate, removing her from the line of succession, and second, it cleanses Henry of any blame for the entire affair, presenting him as a victim of a deceitful, manipulative woman who tricked him into a false marriage. Historians still argue whether Cranmer's role in this annulment was an act of personal cowardice or a pragmatic necessity to preserve the nascent English Reformation. Many believe Cranmer sacrificed Anne's life and legal standing to save himself and the Reformed Church that Henry had founded. Had he resisted, the entire structure of the Church of England could have been threatened, and a more conservative anti-Boleyn figure would have taken his place. By complying, he survived to later play a major role in shaping the spiritual future of the country, albeit at a terrible moral price. Anne, back in the Tower, is informed of the annulment. The news is yet another cruel blow, stripping her of the one title she cared for more than her life, the legitimacy of her daughter. Her final days are spent not only preparing for death, but also mourning the official erasure of her entire queenship. She is now, legally, simply, the Lady Anne, and her daughter, a bastard. The king has not only killed her, but he has tried to erase her. The ecclesiastical court at Lambeth therefore serves as the final, necessary curtain call of the political drama. It ensures that no matter what Anne's religious friends or European allies might claim, Henry's path to his next queen, Jane Seymour, is legally and spiritually clear. The stage is now perfectly set for the final, bloody act. The verdict has been delivered, the sentence pronounced, and the marriage annulled. You now join Queen Anne Boleyn for the final hours of her life, confined to the very same royal apartments in the Tower of London where she celebrated her coronation. This period, May 17th to 19th, 1536, is a strange, profound study in human resilience and the preparation for a meticulously planned death. Anne's behaviour in these final hours is a mainstream historical fact that utterly defied the expectations of her accusers. She showed a remarkable, almost unnerving bravery and composure. Instead of descending into hysteria or despair, she achieved a state of calm resignation, focusing entirely on her spiritual preparation and ensuring a dignified exit. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that her final performance on the scaffold would cement her legacy. You observe the stark contrast between the internal terror she must have felt and the external peace she projected. She received communion, confessed her sins, and spent considerable time in prayer. Her primary concern was for a good death, a concept crucial in the deeply religious Tudor society. A calm, pious death was often seen as proof of a clear conscience and God's favour, a final, powerful repudiation of the monstrous crime she had been convicted of. The logistics of her execution are now being arranged with an unsettling speed. The king, in a final, calculating act of mercy, commutes her sentence from burning to beheading. But Anne, still concerned about the brutality of the English axe, had sent that desperate plea to Cromwell for the specialist executioner. You watch as the arrangements are made. The king commands that the execution be private, held on a temporary scaffold erected within the secure confines of the Tower Green, away from the public eye. This decision to use the Tower Green instead of the public scaffold at Tower Hill is a brilliant cold political move. It is a quirky or fringe tidbit of the day's events. The king wanted Anne dead, but he did not want a public spectacle that might incite popular unrest or turn Anne into a martyr. Executing her privately limited the audience to a few hundred carefully selected officials, nobles, and the foreign ambassadors, like Chapuis, ensuring the immediate narrative remained tightly controlled. The king's mercy was a political tool. He spared her the indignity of a common death and the agony of the fire, but only to ensure his own political convenience. The arrival of the executioner is a chilling detail. A skilled swordsman is summoned from Calais, then an English possession in France. The sword, rather than the axe, promised a single clean stroke. This was, in a twisted way, the king acquiescing to Anne's final desperate wish for a swift end. You hear the hushed conversations about the swordsman's professionalism, a technical detail overlaying the human tragedy. In her final days, Anne reportedly made several light, almost macabre jokes. When told the executioner was coming, she quipped that she had a little neck and hoped he would have an easy job. This dark humour is her final assertion of control, transforming her fear into an oddly comforting calmness. She turns her own impending death into a wry observation, robbing her enemies of the sight of a broken woman. You listen as she talks to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, her jailer. She swears upon the salvation of her soul that she is innocent of the capital charges for which she is condemned. This solemn, final oath, made in the shadow of the scaffold, is her last, unwavering statement of innocence to the world. Historians still argue whether Anne's incredible calm in her last hours was genuine faith, or a carefully maintained facade designed to secure the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth. Many scholars contend that Anne's composed dignity was primarily aimed at God and posterity, ensuring that no one could say she died a terrified, guilty traitor. Her final hours were, in essence, a final persuasive argument for her own righteousness. As the dawn of May 19th breaks, you watch as Anne dresses for the last time. She chooses a grey or crimson damask gown, trimmed with fur, a final assertion of her rank. She puts on the garter, a small ribbon used for tying back the hair, a final feminine detail before her hair is pinned up and covered. Every decision, every slow movement is a statement. She is not preparing to die. She is preparing to perform her death. The scaffold awaits, and the Queen walks toward her fate with a calculated, tragic grace. The hour is around 9 a.m. on Friday, May 19th, 1536. The final scene of this devastating drama is set upon the specially erected scaffold on the Tower Green. You are among the small, exclusive crowd, a few hundred nobles, officials, and the foreign ambassadors, the carefully controlled audience for the execution of Queen Anne Boleyn. The privacy is a calculated act, a mainstream historical fact designed to suppress the spectacle and ensure Anne's death does not inspire martyrdom. As Anne is escorted from the Queen's lodgings, you notice she's still dressed in the dignity of her station, though some accounts differ on the colour of her gown, reporting either a dark grey damask or a crimson underskirt. She carries herself with the same measured composure she maintained throughout the trial. She's accompanied by two of her ladies, whose silent distress contrasts sharply with Anne's unnerving calm. She mounts the scaffold steps with remarkable steadiness. Before the executioner, the professional swordsman summoned from Calais, is introduced, Anne is required to address the crowd. This final speech is a political act of immense consequence, and you lean in to hear every measured word. Her speech is a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity and subtle defiance. It is a testament to her intelligence and her primary goal, to protect her daughter, Elizabeth, and ensure her own soul's salvation. She does not declare her innocence of the crimes of treason and incest directly. To do so would be to openly challenge the king's justice and risk Henry's vengeance on her family or her daughter. Instead, she employs a clever rhetorical sleight of hand. You hear her speak, her voice clear. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." This is the ultimate bitter irony. By praising Henry as a gentler and more merciful prince, she is actually sealing his narrative. A merciful prince can only execute a subject who is truly guilty. But immediately she adds the critical caveat, "And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." This is the subtle defiance, a quirky or fringe tidbit of her final words, an explicit invitation to all future historians and observers to examine the evidence and conclude that she was, in fact, innocent. She places the burden of judgment not on herself, but on those who will scrutinize the king's actions. She concludes by praying for her soul and accepting her death, stating she will receive it without fear. Her piety and control in this final performance are designed to contrast with the portrait of the wicked, promiscuous woman painted by the prosecution. A woman who dies this calmly and religiously, she implies, cannot be guilty of monstrous crimes. The formalities quickly conclude. She kneels down, her ladies remove her jewelled hood and prepare her neck. Anne binds her own eyes with a linen cloth, another act of self-possession. She kneels upright on the platform. The executioner, using the more precise sword rather than the heavy axe, ensures the swiftness she desired. The final, terrifying moment is deliberately engineered to be quick. You hear the final command, "Where is my executioner?" a slight diversionary tactic used by the swordsman. Then, in a terrifying flash, the deed is done. One clean strike. The head of Queen Anne Boleyn falls. The execution is over, and with it, the most scandalous trial in English history. Henry VIII's desire for a new queen and a male heir has been satisfied. The body of the executed queen is quickly placed in an old arrow chest, a final indignity, and interred in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. The entire episode from arrest to execution took less than 3 weeks. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn's calculated composure on the scaffold ultimately saved her reputation more than any direct claim of innocence could have. Her dignified death, witnessed by hostile observers like Chapuis, was recorded and transmitted across Europe, transforming her from a convicted traitor into a tragic, unjustly executed victim in the eyes of many. She lost her life, but she salvaged her legacy. The final act of cruelty is the speed of the king's rebound. The very next day, Henry VIII is publicly courting Jane Seymour, and within 11 days they are married. The Queen is dead, the new Queen is ready, and the King's brutal will has triumphed over law, family and truth. It is time to leave the shadows of the tower, to let the chilling dampness of the stone and the echoes of the crowd fade from your mind. That was Anne Boleyn's story, a tempest of ambition, betrayal, and terrifying political power. A tragedy that, like so many others in history, was written not in the pursuit of justice, but in the service of a king's changing will. The darkness is receding now. The tension of the trial is dissipating. You have witnessed the truth. Anne was not defeated by evidence, but by a system rigged against her, a victim of a monstrous, cynical legal fiction. Her greatest triumph in the end was her dignity, her composure in the face of inevitable destruction, which ensured that her voice, however subtly delivered, would be heard across the centuries. It's time to close your eyes, let go of the court, and allow the quiet calm of the night to settle back around you. The past is done, the present is safe and still. Let yourself drift now, remembering only the quiet strength of the woman who faced the scaffold with such grace.